Okay, students, the early 19th century immigration policy of the United States can be characterized as an open door for white Europeans with explicit instructions concerning the forced immigration of Africans to slavery. There were few laws concerning immigration, and most that were enacted until the Civil War mainly addressed transatlantic shipping and reporting requirements for the ships bringing immigrants to the United States. The American Revolution slowed immigration to the United States, and the defeat of the British spurred an immigration amongst British loyalists. So with the end of the war, however, immigration soon resumed, and the number of immigrants rapidly grew. Now, although the Constitution does not address the issue of immigration, George Washington welcomed not only, in his words, the opulent and respected stranger, but also the oppressed and persecuted of all nations and religions. And Thomas Jefferson expressed some fears about the political assimilation of immigrants from nations that were ruled by absolute monarchs, but he also advocated government policies to attract immigrants who were wealthy or skilled. So most leaders of the new United States welcomed immigrants from Europe, and meanwhile the Constitution was more explicit concerning the forced immigration of Africans. So the framers of the Constitution prohibited Congress from restricting the importation of slaves prior to 1808. So the composition of the post-revolutionary voluntary immigration was not significantly changed from the pre-revolutionary period. In other words, the British and the Scottish immigrants dominated the flow in these decades, and most of these immigrants settled in the cities of the Northeast. And like their predecessors, these immigrants experienced considerable economic opportunity. Immigrants of this era had the option of migration westward as Indian removal proceeded unabashed. And this geographic mobility reduced the potential for the formation of cohesive ethnic communities and also reduced the likelihood of anti-immigrant movements by the U.S. born in the cities and regions where the immigrants first settled. Excuse me. So during the first decade of this country's history, the elite consensus supporting unfettered European immigration is going to give way to a period of anti-immigrant fervor that is going to reach its peak with the passage of what are known as the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. So the first important act concerning immigrants during the first decade of this country's history came during a time of fear and reaction. And the first act concerning immigrants introduced the concept of alien and associated it with sedition. Now the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798 were passed during a time of bitter partisan conflict between the Federalist Party of John Adams and the Democratic Party of Thomas Jefferson. And the origins of anti-immigrant fervor were both domestic and international. Now, domestically, immigrants were seen as a potential source of support for oppositional politics. Internationally, the cause was the French Revolution and the political turbulence that it spurred throughout Europe. Political refugees arrived en masse in the United States in the late 1790s, and many in the United States feared that the ideas of these political refugees would destabilize the new U.S. democracy. So this concern about immigrants translated into a political tone that questioned one's loyalty to the United States. And the administration of John Adams viewed immigrants as lending support to Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican following. So let's hear from historian Eric Forner as he explains the atmosphere under which the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed.
Well, in 1798, the United States, under the presidency of John Adams, was involved in what was called the quasi-war with France. France and England were at war. The United States wasn't fully at war, but it was engaged in certain naval battles with France, and there was fear of a broader war. Congress, under the control of the Federalist Party, passed these Alien and Sedition Acts. The Alien Act basically gave the president the right to deport any immigrant he wanted, largely because the Federalist Party thought a lot of these immigrants coming in the 1790s were radical Jeffersonians who were voting for the Jeffersonian Republican Party. The Sedition Act basically made it a federal crime to criticize the government. As in other wars, the government doesn't like criticism, and it defines criticism of its policies as unpatriotic, as seditious, etc. So the Sedition Act made it possible for the federal government to prosecute and jail particularly newspaper editors who criticized the Adams administration. it was mostly a political measure. I mean, these newspapers weren't doing anything which had any effect on the quasi-war with France, but an election was coming up 2 years later, the election of 1800. The Jeffersonian Party was rising, and the Adams administration was trying to crush out political opposition. Somewhere between 10 and 15 newspaper editors actually were put on trial under the Sedition Act, and some of them were thrown in jail. The most famous was Matthew Lyon, a member of Congress from Vermont, who also edited a newspaper very strongly anti-Adams, and he was actually convicted under the Sedition Act and jailed for a while. But the reaction against this was very strong and actually contributed to the election of Jefferson in 1800, when the slogan of the Jeffersonians was Jefferson and Liberty. And one of the things they meant by liberty was rescinding the Alien and Sedition Acts, which they did soon after getting into office.
Let's go ahead and take a look at a film clip of Adams and Jefferson's encounter with political division amongst the slaveholding classes and the capitalist classes. John Adams portrays the merchant classes, and Thomas Jefferson portrays the slaveholding classes. Stephen Delane plays Thomas Jefferson, and Paul Giamatti does a wonderful job portraying John Adams. And here they're talking about the Alien and Sedition Acts, and this is what's going to cause Jefferson to quit John Adams' administration as vice president, and then eventually challenge him for the presidency in 1800.
By these measures, some within your party hope to silence the opposition. I assure you they will give it body and solidarity.
I am a party of one, Thomas. No.
Why blacken your fragile reputation by an assault on the freedoms for which we both fought? Intend to ship out the entire French population of the United States? Along with any other luckless soul who happens to voice a contrary opinion?
Well, if that contrary opinion threatens to divide the nation at a time when we must stand united, then yes, I will do just that. I'm interested with the nation's safety, Thomas. This war measures will protect us from insurrection and subversion.
There is no war.
And that is the principle behind these measures. Prevention.
Cannot protect the nation by attacking the right of every man to speak freely without fear. You're trampling on the Constitution. That you and I...
Okay, that film clip helps us appreciate the dialogue over immigration policy during the era. And immigrants fleeing revolution in Europe had the potential of creating conduct or speaking language inciting rebellion against the authority of the state. And John Adams' Federalist Party used this act to incarcerate Democratic Republicans and journalists who challenged Federalist policy. It was passed to control a perceived threat to U.S. national security. So Thomas Jefferson escaped to Montebello, and when Thomas Jefferson came to power in 1800, as Eric Foner shares, his administration abolished the Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798. But what is important to note about this experience is that white European immigrants are always considered by politicians as potential sources of support. And most importantly, the term alien is associated with sedition, and that is the key. So let's appreciate the early administration's treatment of citizenship or naturalization laws. Among the few powers explicitly reserved in the Constitution for the federal government is that of naturalization. The national government, not state governments, retains control of naturalization. And the constitutional mandate of Article 1, Section 8 vests naturalization powers with the national government, not the state governments. Now, had national powers rested with the states, states not wishing to receive immigrants could have developed restrictive naturalization rules. And the first Congress developed an outline for naturalization requirements that has survived for the past 230 years. Now, with a brief 4-year exception to the rule in the early history of the nation, most immigrants have been assured of a relatively quick transition to citizenship. Despite periodic local passions against immigrants, the United States has consistently provided immigrants a path to citizenship. Policymakers have addressed who should be offered citizenship and who should administer their transition from immigrant to citizen. So U.S. naturalization law has examined the question of who should be offered U.S. citizenship in two ways. The first involves the category of immigrants to be offered citizenship. Who should be allowed citizenship? The second concerns the characteristic and abilities that individuals within these categories need to have to be eligible for naturalization. Now, throughout the 19th century, Congress's primary concern was who should be allowed citizenship. And beginning at the turn of the 20th century, the debates focused on the characteristics and abilities that individuals possessed. Now, students, I'm having you read from a website from the Immigration and Naturalization Service on an interpretation of their history in the early period. So please go to that website. Please become familiar with how they eventually will create categories of peoples who are eligible to become citizens. And again, the debates focus on the characteristics and the abilities that individuals possess. It is a very interesting read. You should understand it. Now, in one of its first acts, the first Congress established a framework for U.S. naturalization. The law addressed both the question of categories and individual qualifications. So in 1790, Congress extended the privilege of naturalization to all quote-unquote free white persons. There were residency and character requirements, but you had to be white. Among white immigrants, individuals had to have resided in the U.S. for 2 years, and in the state of application for 1 year. So you had to reside in the U.S. for 2 years, and in the state that you were applying for citizenship for 1 year. And this was the 1790 naturalization law. Applicants were to be of good character and had to take an oath to support the Constitution. Children became citizens through their parents' application. And the privilege of applying for citizenship was limited to men. Women could only gain citizenship through their husbands. Now, the First Amendment to the law came just 5 years later. In 1795, Congress extended the minimum period of U.S. residence to 5 years and added 2 requirements. In addition to swearing allegiance to the Constitution, new applicants had to renounce their former allegiance by name. For example, an immigrant from England had to renounce, allegiance to the King of England. Immigrants also had to renounce hereditary titles to nobility. This was a requirement that remains today as a question in the naturalization application. So in response to the anti-immigrant fervor of the Alien and Sedition Acts, Congress amended the law in 1798 by extending the period of residence to 14 years. And this was part of its effort to limit access to U.S. citizenship. And Congress excluded from eligibility citizens of countries in which the U.S. was at war. So the 1798 naturalization laws were a complement to the Alien and Sedition Acts of the John Adams administration, simply because of the fear of the French and Thomas Jefferson's Democratic Republican Party. So the Naturalization Act of 1798 extended the period of residence to 14 years, and it limited access to U.S. citizenship by excluding from eligibility citizens of countries with which the United States was at war. But when Thomas Jefferson came back to rose to power in 1800, by 1802, national concern about loyalty declined, and under the Jefferson administration, the naturalization requirements of 1795 were reestablished. The requirement of 5 years of residence prior to naturalization was enacted in 1802, and it has not been changed since. Now, who should administer the award of citizenship? This is where the local administration of laws comes in handy. In the 19th century, U.S. naturalization policy was characterized by local administration. So students, when you read from the Immigration Naturalization Service website, you're going to see when the federal government will take over the administration policy. But states and localities implemented the minimum federal standards, and states and localities decided who should join the polity. While the federal laws were concerned with the questions of what types of people were eligible, local governments evaluated whether applicants met minimum federal standards. And since there were no reporting requirements, scholars have no idea how many immigrants earned U.S. citizenship through the naturalization process prior to 1907. Local governments provided documentation to demonstrate the immigrant was a U.S. citizen. So without federal regulation, local governments could use their power to limit or facilitate access to naturalization. And many state and local governments in the late 19th and early 20th centuries saw immigration as a rich pool for populated territory that was taken from native peoples. Other states followed nativist impulses by using local discretion to exclude from successful naturalization some immigrants who were eligible. Despite the potential for local abuse and exclusion, the use of local discretion facilitated naturalization. Now, the failure to assure standardized administration reflects a problem in the delivery of many governmental services. So the legacy of local administrations remain today, as we can see in the heated climate in Arizona and the passage of Arizona's controversial SB 1070. Okay, I will continue with part 3 in the next presentation.